The evening had started out innocently enough. Clara had cooked her signature pasta dish, one of the few meals she made without complaint, and the house was filled with the scent of garlic and fresh basil. We sat across from each other at the dining table, her sipping wine, me nursing a whiskey. The conversation was light, even pleasant. For a moment, I allowed myself to believe we were simply a husband and wife sharing an ordinary evening. But the cracks were already there. I'd seen them forming over the past few months, little things that added up to something I couldn't quite put my finger on. The way Clara's laughter seemed more genuine when she was on her phone. The sudden interest in her appearance, as though she were dressing for someone other than me. The way she'd grown distant, even when she was sitting right beside me. Still, I had tried to ignore it. Tried to convince myself that it was all in my head, that our marriage wasn't as fragile as it felt. But that night, Clara shattered any illusions I had left. After dinner, we moved to the couch. Clara leaned into me, her head resting on my shoulder. It felt like a truce, a rare moment of closeness in what had become a battlefield of silence and avoidance. I tilted her chin up and kissed her, a soft, lingering kiss meant to remind her, and maybe myself, of what we used to have. And that's when she said it. It was barely a whisper, just a soft exhale of a name that wasn't mine. Daniel. I froze, my lips still hovering near hers. My mind raced to catch up with what I'd just heard. Daniel. There was no mistaking it. She hadn't said it absent-mindedly or by accident. It was deliberate, intentional. I pulled back slightly, searching her face for an explanation. Her eyes widened for a fraction of a second, a flicker of guilt flashing across her features. Then, just as quickly, her expression shifted to one of indifference, a mask she wore so well. Did you just say Daniel? I asked, my voice low and steady, though my heart was pounding in my chest. She shrugged, a casual gesture that felt like a slap to the face. Maybe I did, she said, her tone light, almost amused. So what? I stared at her, the air between us thick with tension. Why would you say his name while we were kissing? Her smile was small and cruel, her eyes glinting with something I couldn't quite place. Maybe because I wish I was kissing him instead? The words hit me like a freight train, knocking the wind out of me. For a moment, I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. My wife, my partner, the woman I had built my life with, had just admitted, so casually, that she wanted to be with another man. I waited for the anger to rise, for the explosion of rage that should have followed her admission. But instead, something colder, sharper settled over me. I looked at her, really looked at her, and saw the arrogance in her posture, the way she tilted her chin as though daring me to react. She thought she held all the power. She thought I would crumble beneath the weight of her betrayal. So I smiled. It wasn't a warm smile, or even a kind one. It was calculated, a mask to hide the storm brewing inside me. Well, I said calmly, leaning back against the couch, I hope he's worth it. Clara blinked, clearly not expecting my reaction. She opened her mouth to say something, but I held up a hand to stop her. Don't, I said, my voice firm. Don't insult me by pretending this was some kind of slip-up. You knew exactly what you were saying. And believe me, you'll regret every word by morning. I spent the rest of the evening playing the role of the composed husband. I didn't yell or accuse her of anything. Instead, I let her think she'd won, that her admission had left me too stunned to do anything about it. Clara, emboldened by what she saw as my passivity, carried on as though nothing had happened. She poured herself another glass of wine, scrolling through her phone with a small, satisfied smile. But inside, I was calculating my next move. I knew that confronting her directly wouldn't get me anywhere. Clara thrived on drama, on twisting situations to make herself the victim. If I lashed out, she'd use it as ammunition to justify her actions. No, I needed to be smarter than that. I replayed her words in my mind, each one cutting deeper than the last. She wished she was kissing Daniel instead. Daniel. The name rolled around in my head, sparking memories of the man himself. He was charming, sure, but there was a smugness about him that had always rubbed me the wrong way. Clara had always seemed fond of him, laughing a little too hard at his jokes, standing a little too close during conversations. I had noticed but dismissed it, not wanting to seem paranoid. Now, I saw everything clearly. Clara's betrayal wasn't a sudden lapse in judgment. It was deliberate, calculated. And if she thought I would let it slide, she was sorely mistaken. That night, as Clara slept soundly in our bed, I stayed awake, staring at the ceiling. My mind was already piecing together a plan, step by step. I didn't know exactly how it would play out, but one thing was certain. Clara would learn that actions and words had consequences. For now, though, I let her believe she had the upper hand. Let her bask in her arrogance, her confidence that she'd shattered me. The game had just begun, and I was playing for keeps. The following morning felt surreal. Clara was her usual self, or at least the version of herself she wanted me to see. A woman confident that she had her husband wrapped around her finger. She hummed softly as she poured herself coffee, glancing at me with an almost mocking smirk. I didn't bite. Instead, I played along, asking her about her plans for the day and pretending not to notice the way her phone buzzed on the counter. She glanced at it quickly, her expression giving nothing away, but I had no doubt who was on the other end. Daniel. By mid-morning, Clara had left for one of her appointments, which I strongly suspected involved more than errands. As soon as the door closed behind her, I grabbed my keys. I didn't need proof to know the truth. Her whispered confession and flippant remarks were proof enough. I knew where Daniel lived. His house was only a few streets over, a comfortable place he had bragged about during neighborhood gatherings. He had always been the charming one in the group, quick with a joke or a compliment that somehow skirted the line of propriety. And Clara had always been receptive to his attention, her laughter lingering a little too long when he was around. It was time to end this. The walk up to his door felt heavy, each step echoing in my mind as I prepared for what was about to happen. My heart pounded, not with fear, but with the raw anticipation of confrontation. I rang the doorbell once, twice. A moment later, the door opened to reveal Daniel, standing there in a casual t-shirt and sweatpants, his hair slightly tousled. His expression flickered with surprise, and then something else. "Ethan," he said, his voice uncertain. "What's up, man?" I didn't waste time with pleasantries. "We need to talk," I said, my tone leaving no room for argument. Daniel stepped back hesitantly, motioning for me to come in. As I entered, I noticed the way his eyes darted toward his phone on the coffee table, the screen lighting up briefly with a notification. "Look," he started, holding up his hands defensively. "If this is about—" I cut him off. "Don't," I said sharply. "Don't insult me by pretending you don't know why I'm here." For a moment, he tried to play innocent. "Ethan, I have no idea what you're talking about," he said, his voice laced with faux confusion. "If Clara said something—" I took a step closer, my fists clenching at my sides. "She said enough," I interrupted, my voice low and cold. "She said your name, Daniel, while we were kissing. And then she told me she wished she was with you instead. So don't stand there and pretend you're clueless." His face paled, the mask of innocence slipping for just a moment before he caught himself. "Ethan, listen." "No," I said, my voice rising. "You listen. I don't care how this started, or what she's told you. This ends now. Do you understand me?" Daniel's bravado crumbled under the weight of my anger. He stepped back, his hands still raised as though to shield himself. Okay, he said quickly, his voice shaking. It wasn't supposed to go this far." My blood boiled at his admission. "How far did it go, Daniel?" I asked, taking another step forward. "Tell me the truth, or I swear." "It was just a few times," he blurted out, his voice cracking. "I swear, Ethan, I didn't mean for it to happen. She came to me, okay? She was the one who started it." The words hit me like a physical blow. I had known, deep down, that Clara's betrayal was more than emotional. But hearing it confirmed, hearing him say it aloud, was almost too much to bear. "You're a coward," I said, my voice trembling with barely restrained fury. "And you're pathetic." Daniel tried to say something else, but I didn't give him the chance. My fist connected with his jaw, the impact sending him stumbling backward into the coffee table. He looked up at me, clutching his face, his expression a mix of pain and fear. "Ethan, please," he stammered. "I'm sorry. I swear. I'll stay away from her. Just don't tell Sophia. She'll leave me." Sophia. The name rang in my ears, a reminder of the woman who had trusted him, just as I had trusted Clara. The thought of her, oblivious to the betrayal happening under her nose, filled me with a new kind of rage. "Don't worry," I said, my voice cold. "She's going to find out. You don't get to escape this, Daniel. Not this time." I left Daniel's house without looking back, my hands still trembling as I gripped the steering wheel. I drove aimlessly for a while, my thoughts racing as I tried to process what had just happened. Part of me felt satisfied. Confronting Daniel, hearing him admit his betrayal, it was a small victory. But it didn't erase the pain of what Clara had done, or the anger that still simmered beneath the surface. As I pulled into my driveway, I glanced at the house I had shared with Clara for years. It didn't feel like home anymore. Not with her inside, living a life of lies while pretending everything was fine. I knew I couldn't stop it, Daniel. The confrontation was just the beginning. Clara needed to face the consequences of her actions, too. And this time, I wouldn't hold back. When I walked back into the house, the weight of everything hung heavily in the air. The walls that once held laughter, shared meals, and whispered conversations now felt like a prison. Clara wasn't home yet, but I knew it was only a matter of time before she walked through the door, wearing the same smug expression she'd had all week. I stood in the entryway, my fists clenched, staring at the place we'd called home. Not anymore. I wasn't going to let her continue disrespecting me. Not in this house, not in my life. It was time to take control. The first thing I did was call the locksmith. The man on the phone sounded cheerful, even as I tersely explained that I needed the locks changed immediately. "It's an emergency," I said, my tone leaving no room for questions. Within an hour, he arrived, toolbox in hand. As he worked, I started making other calls. First, to my financial manager. "John," I said firmly, "I need you to freeze every joint account Clara and I share. Transfer my funds into a private account and ensure she can't access a single cent." There was a pause on the other end of the line, followed by a hesitant, "Are you sure, Ethan?" "Absolutely," I replied. "Do it now." The next call was to my lawyer, Paul. He'd been a friend of mine for years, and I trusted him implicitly. "Paul," I said, my voice steady, "I need to file for divorce. Today." Paul didn't ask why. He knew me well enough to understand that if I was calling him, it wasn't a decision I made lightly. "Come by the office tomorrow morning," he said. "We'll get started." By the time Clara returned home that evening, the locks were changed, and her access to my finances was cut off. I was sitting on the couch, calm and composed, waiting for her. When she tried to open the door, the sound of her fumbling with the key brought a bitter smile to my face. "What the hell?" I heard her mutter from the other side of the door. Then came the knocking. Firm at first, then louder and more insistent. "Ethan," she yelled, "let me in." I didn't move. The knocking turned into pounding, her voice growing shrill. "Ethan, open the damn door. What's going on?" Finally, I got up and opened the door just wide enough to look at her through the gap. She stood there, her face flushed with anger, holding a shopping bag in one hand and her purse in the other. "What's going on?" she demanded. "Why can't I get in?" "Because you don't live here anymore," I said calmly. Her jaw dropped. "What are you talking about? This is my house too." "Not anymore," I replied. "The locks are changed, the accounts are frozen, and I've already started the divorce process. You made your choice, Clara. Now you have to live with it." For a moment, she just stood there, staring at me like I'd grown a second head. Then the tears started. "Ethan," she said, her voice trembling. "Come on, don't do this. I messed up, okay? I was stupid, but we can fix this. We've been through so much together. Don't throw it all away." Her tears might have worked on me once. In fact, they had, more times than I cared to admit. But now, they felt hollow, manipulative. "Throw it all away?" I repeated, my voice cold. "You threw it away the moment you whispered his name while we were kissing. You threw it away when you told me you wished you were with him instead. Don't put this on me, Clara. This is all you. She reached out, her hand brushing the doorframe. Please, she whispered. We can fix this. I'll stop seeing him. I'll do whatever you want. I shook my head, my resolve unshaken. It's too late, Clara. You didn't just betray me. You destroyed us. And I'm not interested in picking up the pieces. I closed the door in her face, locking it behind me. Her muffled cries came through the wood, followed by more pounding. But I didn't open it again. I walked away, leaving her on the porch, shouting empty promises and apologies. The next morning, I walked into Paul's office with a folder of documents under my arm. He greeted me with a firm handshake, his expression serious. You ready for this? He asked. More than ready, I replied. We spent the next few hours drafting the paperwork, outlining everything I wanted. No shared assets, no reconciliation. Clara would get nothing. Not a cent, not the house, not another second of my time. She's going to fight this, Paul warned me. You know that, right? Let her, I said. She doesn't have a leg to stand on. As I signed the final document, a strange sense of relief washed over me. For the first time in weeks, I felt like I was reclaiming my life. Clara's betrayal had knocked me down, but it hadn't broken me. And now, I was taking the first steps towards something better. That evening, I returned home to find Clara's things gone from the porch. I didn't know where she'd gone, and frankly, I didn't care. The locks were secure, the accounts were in my name, and the divorce was in motion. I sat on the couch with a glass of whiskey, staring out the window as the sun dipped below the horizon. The house was quiet, almost unnervingly so, but it felt like the kind of quiet that comes after a storm. This wasn't the end of the story, far from it. Clara would undoubtedly try to fight me, to twist the narrative and play the victim. But I was ready for her. Because now, for the first time in a long time, I was in control. The next step in unraveling this twisted saga began with Sophia, Daniel's wife. I couldn't let her remain in the dark while her husband played her for a fool. She deserved to know the truth, as much as it would hurt. So, armed with the details of my confrontation with Daniel, I decided to visit her. Sophia was no stranger to difficult conversations. A high-powered attorney, she had a reputation for being calm under pressure and laser-focused in the courtroom. But I wondered how she would handle something this personal. Would she lash out? Would she even believe me? Regardless, I knew I had to tell her. Sophia agreed to meet me at her office. The modern, glass-paneled building was intimidating, much like the woman herself. As I sat in the waiting area, my heart pounded. Not because I was nervous about her reaction. I was prepared for whatever came. But because this felt like another step in reclaiming the control Daniel and Clara had taken from us. Ethan, she greeted me as she opened her office door. Her voice was professional, but her eyes carried a hint of concern. Please come in. I stepped into her immaculate office, its shelves lined with legal texts and awards. She gestured for me to sit as she closed the door and took her place behind the desk. What's this about? She asked, her tone measured. I took a deep breath. Sophia, this isn't easy to say, but I feel like you have a right to know. Daniel, he's been having an affair. Her expression didn't change, but I could see the faintest flicker of something in her eyes. Shock, maybe, or suspicion. Go on, she said. With my wife, Clara, I continued, my voice steady despite the weight of the words. I confronted him about it last night. He admitted everything. Sophia leaned back in her chair, her fingers steepled in front of her. Do you have proof? Her calm demeanor was unnerving, but I'd expected nothing less. I slid a folder across the desk, containing everything I had gathered, the text messages, the photos Liam had captured of their meetups, and the details of Daniel's confession. Sophia opened the folder, her eyes scanning the contents with precision. She didn't flinch, didn't let a single emotion slip. When she was done, she closed the folder and looked up at me, her face unreadable. Well, she said finally, I suppose I shouldn't be surprised. Her reaction threw me off. You're not surprised? I asked. Sophia gave a bitter laugh. Ethan, I've been married to Daniel long enough to know he's a narcissist. I've suspected for a while that something was going on, but I didn't have concrete proof until now. Her calm fury was palpable. It wasn't the kind of anger that erupted in shouting or tears. It was colder, more deliberate. I realized then that Daniel was in far more trouble than he realized. "What are you going to do?" I asked. Sophia's lips curled into a tight smile. "Oh, I'll take care of it. Don't worry about that." She leaned forward, her eyes locking onto mine. "Thank you for telling me, Ethan. I know that wasn't easy. But I assure you, Daniel is about to learn a very valuable lesson about consequences." There was something terrifyingly reassuring about the way she said it. I had no doubt that Sophia, with her sharp intellect and legal expertise, was capable of dismantling Daniel's life piece by piece. What I didn't expect was Sophia's next move. Before I left her office, she asked for Clara's phone number. "Why do you need it?" I asked, curious. "Let's just say I have a message to deliver," she replied with a faint smirk. Later that evening, Clara came banging on my door once again, her face pale and her hands trembling. I opened it just enough to see her, keeping my expression neutral. "Ethan, you won't believe what Sophia just said to me," she exclaimed, her voice laced with panic. "Oh, I can believe it," I said coolly. "What did she say?" "She threatened me," Clara cried. "She told me to stay away from Daniel, or she'd make my life miserable. She said she has the resources to ruin me." I leaned against the doorframe, studying her with mild amusement. "Sounds like good advice. You should take it." Clara's jaw dropped. "You're not even going to defend me?" "Defend you?" I asked, raising an eyebrow. "From the wife of the man you've been sleeping with?" "No, Clara. I'm not going to defend you. You've made your choices. Now you get to deal with the consequences." She stared at me, her face crumpling into an expression of pure defeat. For the first time, she seemed to realize just how far she'd fallen, and how little power she had left. After Clara left, I sat on the porch, sipping a glass of whiskey and reflecting on the day. Telling Sophia the truth had been the right thing to do, even if it had been difficult. She was strong, capable, and determined to hold Daniel accountable for his actions. And seeing Clara rattled by Sophia's warning only reinforced what I already knew. Clara's arrogance had been her undoing. The game had shifted. I wasn't just reacting to the betrayal anymore. I was taking control of it, piece by piece. And with Sophia as an unexpected ally, I knew we were just getting started. Clara didn't disappear quietly into the background after being locked out and humiliated. True to her nature, she decided to fight back. Not with honesty or remorse, but with manipulation and lies. It started subtly, with her reaching out to mutual friends and family, spinning her own narrative of events. She's been calling me nonstop. "Anna, my sister, told me one evening over the phone. She said you overreacted, that you've been distant and controlling for months. Is that true?" I couldn't help but laugh at the absurdity of it all. Of course she did. "Did she also tell you she's been having an affair with Daniel?" There was silence on the other end, followed by Anna's sharp intake of breath. "What?" she whispered. I relayed the events of the past week, the whispered name, the smug confession, and her blatant disregard for our marriage. By the time I finished, Anna was furious. "She left that part out," Anna said, her voice laced with venom. "Unbelievable. She made it sound like you were the one who pushed her away." "That's Clara," I replied, my tone bitter. "She'll say whatever she has to say to make herself look like the victim." Over the next few days, I learned that Clara's campaign of manipulation extended beyond Anna. She'd been contacting other family members, claiming that her confession had been a moment of guilt and vulnerability, and that I had overreacted by locking her out and freezing our accounts. She's framing this as a breakdown of communication. "Darren, my best friend, told me. She's saying you've always been distant, that she made one mistake because she felt unloved." I clenched my jaw, the sheer audacity of her lies threatening to push me over the edge. "And do you believe her?" I asked. Darren snorted. "Not for a second. I know you, Ethan. You've always been over backward for her. She's trying to cover her tracks, and honestly, it's pathetic." Despite Darren's reassurance, Clara's lies began to take their toll. Mutual friends started to distance themselves, unsure of who to believe. At work, a colleague pulled me aside to ask if everything was okay at home, Word had apparently spread beyond our immediate circle. Clara was winning the war of perception, at least in some quarters. But I knew the truth, and I wasn't about to let her rewrite history. I reached out to the people who mattered most, my closest friends and family, and told them everything. The whispered name, the smug admission, her affair with Daniel, the evidence I'd gathered. She's trying to manipulate you, I said to each of them, and I need you to know the truth. Most believed me immediately, their loyalty unwavering. But a few, especially those closer to Clara, remained skeptical. People see what they want to see, Sophia told me when I vented my frustration to her. The ones who truly care about you will stand by you. The rest? Let them go. Her words hit home. Clara's lies couldn't erase the truth, and I refused to let her drag me down to her level. Just when I thought I'd heard the worst of Clara's deceit, Darren dropped a bombshell. "Ethan," he said hesitantly over drinks one evening, "there's something you should know." The tone of his voice sent a chill down my spine. "What is it?" I asked. He hesitated, staring into his beer before finally meeting my gaze. "Clara's affair with Daniel. It might not be her first." The words hung in the air like a cloud of smoke, suffocating and inescapable. "What are you talking about?" I demanded. Darren sighed. "Last year, when you were on that work trip, Clara was spotted having dinner with some guy at that fancy Italian place downtown. A friend of mine saw her. They looked close." I clenched my fists, my mind racing. "Why didn't you tell me this sooner?" "I wasn't sure," Darren admitted, "and I didn't want to stir the pot without proof. But after everything that's happened, I thought you should know." Darren's revelation was like gasoline on a fire. If Clara had been unfaithful before Daniel, how long had she been betraying me? How many lies had I accepted without question? That night, I couldn't sleep. I replayed the years of our marriage in my mind, searching for signs I might have missed. The late nights when she claimed to be out with friends. The sudden, unexplained expenses on her credit card. The way she had grown colder, more distant, long before Daniel came into the picture. It all started to add up, painting a picture of a woman who had been betraying me for far longer than I'd realized. The realization didn't break me. If anything, it strengthened my resolve. Clara's lies, her manipulation, her betrayal, they were her burden to bear. I had spent too long carrying the weight of her deceit, and I was done. The next morning, I called Liam, the private investigator. "I need you to look into something for me," I said. "Clara's past. I want to know if there were others before Daniel." Liam didn't hesitate. "I'll get on it," he said. As I hung up the phone, a strange sense of calm washed over me. Clara could spin her stories, manipulate our friends, and play the victim all she wanted. But the truth had a way of coming to light, and when it did, she would have no one left to fool. Clara's desperation was a spectacle, but it only revealed the depth of her guilt. While she scrambled to rewrite the narrative, I focused on what mattered, reclaiming my life and uncovering the full extent of her betrayal. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. After our meeting, I knew Sophia wasn't someone to cross lightly. If there was one thing I was sure of, it was that Daniel's days of coasting through life on charm and deceit were over. She was relentless, meticulous, and determined to make him feel every ounce of the betrayal he had inflicted on her. And she didn't waste any time. The first sign of Sophia's wrath came when Daniel was served divorce papers. I heard about it through Darren, who, like most of the neighborhood, had been keeping a close eye on the fallout from all the chaos. "She hit him where it hurts," Darren said over a beer one night. "He showed up at the gym today looking like he hadn't slept in a week. Apparently, she froze his accounts, and now he's scrambling to figure out how to pay his rent." I wasn't surprised. Sophia was a top-tier attorney, and she knew exactly how to use the system to her advantage. Freezing assets, filing motions, and leveraging her connections were all tools in her arsenal, and she wielded them with precision. Sophia wasn't content to just walk away with her dignity intact. She wanted to ensure that Daniel felt the full weight of his actions. From what I gathered, her divorce filings didn't just focus on splitting assets. She included evidence of his infidelity and financial mismanagement, painting a picture of a man unworthy of sympathy or leniency. "She's ruthless," Darren said, shaking his head in admiration. I heard she's going after everything. His business connections, his car, even the house. Sophia was relentless, but she wasn't being vindictive for the sake of it. Every move she made was calculated, designed to protect herself and to send a clear message. Daniel's actions had consequences, and she wasn't going to be a victim. As Sophia's legal maneuvers played out, the neighborhood became a hotbed of gossip. People whispered about Daniel's downfall at every barbecue and block party. He's been avoiding everyone, one neighbor told me. Hardly ever comes out of the house. And when he does, he looks like he's aged 10 years. Sophia, on the other hand, carried herself with quiet confidence. She still attended neighborhood events, always impeccably dressed and poised. It was as if she was reclaiming her space, refusing to let the scandal define her. One evening, I saw her across the street, chatting with a group of neighbors. She caught my eye and gave a small nod. I returned it, silently grateful for the strength she had shown, not just for herself, but for everyone Daniel had hurt. What I didn't anticipate was how Sophia would handle Clara. While I had expected her to focus solely on Daniel, Sophia made it clear that Clara wasn't off the hook. One evening, Clara called me, again. I had been ignoring her calls for days, but something in her voicemail caught my attention. "Ethan," she said, her voice trembling, "you need to talk to Sophia. She's threatening me. She said she'd ruin me if I ever went near Daniel again. You need to tell her to back off." Her desperation was almost laughable. I knew Sophia well enough by now to understand that she wasn't making idle threats. Clara had poked the bear, and the bear was responding accordingly. Later, Sophia filled me in on what had happened. "She needed to be put in her place," Sophia said simply, sipping her coffee as we sat on her porch. "I told her that if she so much as looked in Daniel's direction, I would ensure she'd never find stable ground again." I raised an eyebrow. "And how did she take that?" Sophia smirked. "Not well, but she got the message." Her confidence was almost contagious. Seeing Clara rattled was satisfying, but knowing Sophia had taken it upon herself to deliver that blow was even more so. By the time Sophia was done with Daniel, his life was in shambles. His business contacts had abandoned him, his finances were in ruins, and his reputation was irreparably damaged. He was forced to move out of the house he had once bragged about, taking up residence in a rundown apartment on the edge of town. The man who had once charmed his way into every social circle was now a pariah, avoided by the same people who had once laughed at his jokes and admired his confidence. Watching Sophia dismantle Daniel's life piece by piece was a stark reminder of how far I'd come. Months ago, I might have been too angry, too consumed by my own pain, to appreciate the precision and grace with which she handled everything. But now, seeing Daniel face the consequences of his actions, I felt a sense of closure. Sophia wasn't just fighting for herself. She was fighting for me, too, and for anyone who had ever been betrayed by someone they trusted. By the time the dust settled, Sophia had rebuilt her life with quiet dignity. She had finalized her divorce, secured her financial future, and reclaimed her identity. As for Daniel, he was a shell of the man he had once been. His charm, his arrogance, his confidence, it had all been stripped away, leaving nothing but regret and loneliness in its wake. Watching it all unfold, I couldn't help but admire Sophia's strength. She had shown me what it meant to face betrayal head-on and come out the other side stronger. And in her, I found not just an ally, but a kindred spirit. Someone who understood the pain of betrayal and the power of reclaiming your life. The first few weeks after Clara's final desperate attempt to manipulate me felt like walking through a fog, but slowly, the haze began to lift. The weight of her betrayal no longer pressed on my chest every moment. It wasn't just the absence of her lies. It was the newfound space in my life to focus on myself. For years, I'd been so consumed with trying to keep our marriage afloat that I'd lost sight of who I was. I'd given up hobbies I loved, drifted away from close friends, and even neglected my health. Now, with Clara gone, I was determined to rediscover those parts of myself. It started small, simple things like going for runs in the morning, something I hadn't done since we first got married. There was something therapeutic about pounding the pavement, the rhythm of my feet hitting the ground mirroring the steady beating of my heart. It felt like I was running away from the past towards something new. I dusted off my old guitar, a gift from my college days, and began playing again. The first few attempts were clumsy, my fingers stiff and unfamiliar with the strings, but the music came back to me. It was like reconnecting with an old friend. And then there were my friendships. Darren, who had stuck by me through the worst of it, became my anchor. We started meeting up more often, grabbing beers, going to the gym, or just sitting on his porch talking about anything and everything. "You're looking more like yourself," he said one evening. "Not the guy who was always chasing after Clara, trying to make her happy. This guy, he's good." I smiled at that. Darren wasn't one for sentimentality, so his words meant a lot. While Darren's friendship was a constant, another relationship began to grow unexpectedly. My connection with Sophia. It started innocently enough. After everything that happened with Daniel, we'd check in with each other occasionally. At first, it was about practical matters, updates on divorce proceedings, sharing the latest gossip about Daniel and Clara's respective downfalls. But over time, our conversations became more personal. "I didn't realize how much of myself I'd given up for him," Sophia admitted one afternoon over coffee. "He was so good at making me feel like I had to choose between being his wife and being me." I nodded, understanding exactly what she meant. Clara was the same. It was always about her, what she needed, what she wanted. I lost track of what I wanted somewhere along the way. Sophia smiled, a small, knowing smile. "Well, here's to finding ourselves again." Our meetings became more frequent, and I found myself looking forward to them. Sophia had a way of grounding me, of making me feel seen in a way I hadn't felt in years. She was sharp, witty, and fiercely independent, but there was a warmth to her that Daniel had never deserved. It wasn't long before I started noticing the subtle shifts in our interactions. The way her hand would linger just a second longer when she passed me a coffee mug. The way our conversations would drift from light-hearted banter to something deeper, more intimate. One evening, as we sat on her porch watching the sun set, the silence between us felt heavy with unspoken words. I turned to her, studying the way the fading light caught the strands of her hair, and realized just how much I enjoyed being around her. "Can I ask you something?" I said, breaking the silence. "Of course," she replied, turning to meet my gaze. "Do you ever think about what's next? I mean, after all of this, after the dust settles?" Sophia tilted her head, considering my question. "I do," she said softly, "but it's hard to imagine sometimes. Starting over feels daunting." "It does," I admitted, "but it also feels like an opportunity to build something better." Our eyes met, and for a moment, I thought I saw something in her expression, something more than friendship. But neither of us said anything, and the moment passed. Sophia and I both knew better than to rush into anything. We'd been burned before, and the scars were still fresh. Instead, we let things unfold naturally, allowing our connection to deepen without forcing it. We started spending more time together, going for walks, cooking dinner, even tackling home improvement projects side by side. There was something effortless about being with her, a kind of peace I hadn't known in years. One evening, as we painted the walls of her living room, I accidentally splashed paint on her arm. She gasped, pretending to be horrified, and before I knew it, we were in a full-blown paint war. By the end of it, we were both covered in streaks of blue and laughing so hard we could barely breathe. "See?" Sophia said, grinning as she wiped paint off her cheek. "Starting over isn't so bad." The most important part of our budding relationship was trust. We were both cautious, taking things one step at a time. There were moments when the past threatened to creep in, when I'd catch myself wondering if I could truly trust again, or if Sophia was holding back out of fear of being hurt. But we talked about it. We were honest with each other in a way that felt refreshing and new. "Sometimes I feel like I'm waiting for the other shoe to drop," I admitted one night. Sophia nodded. "Me too. But maybe that's just what happens after everything we've been through. We're learning to trust again. It wasn't easy, but it was worth it. With every shared laugh, every meaningful conversation, every quiet moment spent together, I felt the walls around my heart begin to come down. For the first time in years, I felt like I was moving forward. Sophia wasn't just a reminder of what I'd lost. She was a glimpse of what I could have. A relationship built on respect, honesty, and mutual support. It was still early, and we both knew there were no guarantees. But as we sat on her porch one evening, watching the stars appear one by one, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time: hope. "Here's to new beginnings," Sophia said, raising her glass. "To new beginnings," I echoed, clinking my glass against hers. And for the first time, I truly believed it. Eric was always the golden boy of the neighborhood, the one everyone gravitated toward at barbecues, the one who seemed to have it all together. But by now, his carefully crafted image had crumbled into nothing but ashes. The man who had once strutted around with a smug smile now shuffled through life like a ghost, and I can't say I felt sorry for him. The fallout from Sophia's relentless legal campaign hit Eric hard. His accounts were frozen, his assets seized, and he was drowning in legal fees. He tried to appeal to his old friends for help, but most of them had already distanced themselves. No one wanted to be associated with a man whose infidelity and shady dealings had become neighborhood gossip. He started drinking, heavily. People whispered about how they'd seen him stumbling out of the local bar, looking disheveled and lost. His once pristine lawn was now overgrown, and the lights in his house were rarely on at night. One evening, I was sitting on my porch, enjoying the quiet with a glass of whiskey, when I saw Eric's car pull into my driveway. My heart sank. I knew this wasn't going to be a pleasant conversation. He stumbled out of the car, his face red, his movements unsteady. By the time he reached my porch, the stench of alcohol was unmistakable. He stood there for a moment, swaying slightly, before pointing a shaky finger at me. This is all your fault," he slurred. I set my glass down and stood, crossing my arms. "Go home, Eric. You're drunk." He shook his head violently. "No, you don't get to walk away from this. You ruined everything. My marriage, my reputation, everything." His voice cracked, and for a moment, he looked more pitiful than angry. "You did that to yourself," I said, my tone calm but firm. "You lied, cheated, and destroyed your own life. Don't stand here and blame me for your choices." Eric staggered closer, his fists clenched. "You don't get it. You think you're better than me? You think you're the victim here? You're just as much a failure as I am." Before I could respond, he lunged at me, his swing wild and uncoordinated. I easily stepped out of the way, letting him stumble past me. He nearly fell but caught himself on the porch railing, breathing heavily. "Go home, Eric," I said again, my voice cold. "You've already lost everything. Don't make it worse." For a moment, I thought he might try to take another swing, but then his shoulders slumped. He looked up at me, his eyes glassy with a mix of anger and defeat. "She's going to leave me," he whispered, almost to himself. "Sophia's going to take everything." "She already has," I replied. "And you deserve it." Eric stared at me for a long moment before turning and stumbling back to his car. I watched as he drove away, the taillights disappearing into the night. Eric's confrontation with me was the final straw for many in the neighborhood. Word spread quickly, as it always did, and the whispers about him grew louder. People started avoiding him altogether, crossing the street when they saw him coming, cutting conversations short when he tried to engage. "He's a mess," one of the neighbors, Linda, told me during a casual chat. "I saw him yelling at someone in the grocery store the other day. It's like he's completely lost it." Even Clara, who had once been so enamored with him, had distanced herself. She was too busy dealing with her own fallout to stick around and comfort him. The man who had once seemed untouchable was now completely alone. Sophia's divorce proceedings had uncovered more than just his infidelity. Evidence of his shady business practices came to light, and soon, his professional reputation was in tatters. Former clients came forward with complaints, and the local papers picked up the story, painting him as a manipulative fraud. It wasn't long before his small business folded, leaving him unemployed and drowning in debt. He sold his car, then his furniture, and finally, the house that had once been his pride and joy. By the time he moved out, there was nothing left of the confident, charming man he had once been. Watching Eric's downfall was both satisfying and sobering. He had reaped what he had sown, And while part of me felt vindicated, another part couldn't help but pity him. His arrogance, his lies, his betrayal. It had all led him to this point. And yet, as much as he deserved his fate, I couldn't imagine what it must feel like to lose everything. Still, I knew better than to dwell on it. Eric's downfall was his own doing, just as my recovery was my own responsibility. His actions had hurt me, yes, but they didn't define me. Eric's story became a cautionary tale in the neighborhood, a reminder of the consequences of deceit and arrogance. People whispered about him at block parties and coffee shops, their voices tinged with a mix of gossip and schadenfreude. For me, though, Eric's downfall wasn't about revenge. It was about closure. He had tried to destroy my life, but in the end, it was his own life that crumbled. As I sat on my porch that night, watching the stars, I felt a sense of peace. The chaos Eric and Clara had brought into my world was fading, replaced by something quieter, steadier. And for the first time in a long time, I felt truly free. The text came late in the evening, just as I was settling into a rare moment of peace. "Ethan, please, we need to talk. I made a mistake. I still love you." I stared at my phone, the words blurring together in my mind. It was classic Clara, pulling at heartstrings she'd long since severed, trying to manipulate me into giving her another chance. The next morning, she escalated her efforts. My phone buzzed constantly with her messages, each one a mix of contrition, excuses, and emotional pleas. "Ethan, you're being unfair. I was vulnerable. It didn't mean anything. I was confused, but I see now that I belong with you. Can we just talk? You're my husband. You can't just shut me out like this." It was exhausting. Every word felt like an attempt to rewrite the narrative, to paint herself as the victim and me as the unforgiving villain. But I wasn't falling for it. Not this time. Clara didn't stop with texts. She started calling mutual friends, reaching out to family members, trying to rally sympathy and support. "She called me last night," Darren said during one of our meetups. "Cried on the phone for 20 minutes about how much she regrets everything. She says you're being too harsh, that she confessed out of guilt, not malice." I laughed bitterly. Confessed out of guilt? She said she wished she was with Daniel instead of me. That's not guilt, it's arrogance. Darren nodded. I told her she needed to own up to her actions. She didn't like that. Apparently, Clara had also contacted my mother. "She sounded so pitiful," Mom said when she called me, but I told her straight. I raised my son to have self-respect. If she thinks she can manipulate her way back into your life, she's mistaken. My mother's loyalty was unwavering, but not everyone was so steadfast. A few friends, ones closer to Clara, reached out with messages of their own. "Maybe you're being too hard on her. People make mistakes. Are you sure this is worth throwing away your marriage?" It was infuriating, but I knew it wasn't about me. Clara was playing her part masterfully, spinning tales of regret and victimhood to anyone who would listen. One evening, as I returned home from work, I found Clara waiting on the porch. Her hair was disheveled, her makeup smudged, and she clutched a plastic bag as if it contained her last shred of dignity. "Ethan," she said, her voice trembling, "please, just hear me out." I stood at the base of the steps, my arms crossed. "What do you want, Clara?" She stepped closer, tears streaming down her face. "I made a mistake, okay? I was stupid and selfish, and I hurt you. But I still love you. We can fix this." I shook my head, my expression unwavering. "It's too late for that. You didn't just hurt me, Clara. You betrayed me. And then you lied and manipulated everyone around us to make yourself look like the victim. I'm done." She dropped the bag at her feet, pulling at her hair in frustration. "Don't you see? I was confused. Daniel was a mistake. I didn't know what I was doing." "No, you knew exactly what you were doing," I replied coldly. "You didn't just slip and fall into an affair, Clara. You made a choice, over and over again, and now you have to live with the consequences." When she realized I wasn't going to budge, Clara's demeanor changed. The tears dried up, replaced by anger. "You're pathetic," she spat. "You think you're so perfect, so righteous. You think you're better than me?" "I don't think it, Clara," I said, my voice steady. "I know it." She screamed in frustration, kicking the bag she had brought with her. The contents, a few personal items she must have hoped to use as leverage, spilled across the porch. "I gave you everything," she said, her voice breaking. "I gave up my career, my dreams, for you. And this is how you repay me?" I stared at her, incredulous. "You gave up nothing for me, Clara. You chose this life, and you chose to destroy it. That's on you." Finally, she broke. Dropping to her knees, she sobbed uncontrollably, her shoulders shaking as years of lies and manipulation crumbled around her. I didn't feel pity. Not anymore. Her tears weren't for me. They were for herself, for the life she had destroyed with her own hands. A few days later, I heard through the grapevine that Clara had moved in with her sister, Amanda. Amanda was as pragmatic as they came, practical to a fault and utterly devoid of sympathy for drama. "She's lucky I even let her stay," Amanda reportedly told a mutual acquaintance. "She's been a wreck, crying about how she ruined her life. But I told her, you made this mess. Now you have to deal with it." Clara's life had been reduced to ruins. No more fancy dinners, no more social circles fawning over her. Just a small room in her sister's house and the cold realization that she had destroyed everything she once had. As I sat on my porch that evening, watching the sun dip below the horizon, I felt a strange sense of closure. Clara's desperation had been inevitable, but it no longer had power over me. She was a shadow of the woman I had once loved, and while part of me mourned what we had lost, the larger part felt relief. For the first time in years, I was free. Free from her lies, her manipulation, her betrayal. Free to rebuild my life on my own terms. It started gradually, as most meaningful connections do. After everything we'd been through, Sophia and I began leaning on each other more often. At first, it was purely practical. Updates on our respective divorces, sharing information about Clara and Daniel's spiraling lives, or simply venting about the wreckage they'd left behind. But over time, our conversations became less about them and more about us. We discovered a shared love of hiking and started meeting up on Saturday mornings to tackle the trails just outside the city. There was something liberating about being surrounded by nature, far from the neighborhood and its whispers, with nothing but the sound of leaves crunching underfoot and the occasional laugh as we teased each other about who was slowing the pace. One day, as we reached the summit of a particularly challenging trail, Sophia turned to me, her face flushed from the exertion but glowing with a rare, genuine smile. "You know," she said, catching her breath, "I didn't think I'd find peace after everything. But this feels good." "It does," I admitted, looking out at the sprawling view below us. "Better than I expected." We sat there in companionable silence for a while, watching the world below, and for the first time in a long time, I felt a glimmer of hope for the future. Sophia and I were careful, almost to a fault. We both knew the dangers of rushing into something new while the wounds of the past were still raw. Trust was a fragile thing, and neither of us wanted to break it. One evening, after a particularly good meal we'd cooked together at her place, I brought it up. "Do you ever feel hesitant? Like you're waiting for something to go wrong?" Sophia put down her wine glass and nodded. "All the time," she admitted. "I don't think it's about us, though. It's about them. What they did. It's hard to let go of that fear." "Yeah," I said, swirling the whiskey in my glass. "But it feels different with you. Easier. Safer." She smiled at that, a soft, genuine smile that reached her eyes. "It feels different with you, too." We took things slow. No grand declarations, no rushing into labels or commitments. Just two people finding solace in each other's company, rebuilding the trust that our former partners had shattered. Every shared laugh, every quiet moment, every small gesture of kindness became another brick in the foundation we were building. As weeks turned into months, Sophia and I found ourselves carving out a life that felt new and exciting. She encouraged me to embrace the hobbies I'd rediscovered, playing my guitar, tackling home improvement projects, even picking up photography. I, in turn, cheered her on as she dove back into her career with a renewed sense of purpose, taking on cases that challenged and inspired her. One evening, as we sat on her porch with a bottle of wine between us, she glanced at me and said, "You know, I never thought I'd be happy again." But here I am. Me too, I replied, reaching over to give her hand a gentle squeeze. It's funny, isn't it? How life has a way of surprising you. She chuckled. Yeah, I guess it does. The final chapter of our shared story played out at a neighborhood gathering. It had been months since everything had fallen apart, and while the gossip had mostly died down, there were still whispers. People wondered if Sophia and I would show up together. They wondered what Clara and Daniel's absence meant. When we arrived, heads turned. Sophia looked radiant in a simple, elegant dress, her confidence unshakable. I felt a surge of pride walking beside her, knowing how far we'd both come. Ethan, Sophia, Linda, the neighborhood gossip, called out as we stepped into the backyard. Good to see you too. It's been a while. We exchanged pleasantries, dodging the thinly veiled questions about Clara and Daniel. Everyone knew the story by now, but no one dared bring it up directly. Sophia and I stuck together, navigating the crowd with practiced ease. At one point, Darren pulled me aside. You're looking good, man, he said, clapping me on the shoulder. And Sophia, she's something else. She is, I agreed, glancing across the yard at her as she laughed with a small group of neighbors. I got lucky. No, Darren said firmly. You earned it. Clara and Daniel were nowhere to be seen, of course. From what I'd heard, Clara was still living with her sister, trying to piece together a semblance of a life. Daniel, on the other hand, had all but disappeared. His financial ruin, combined with Sophia's ironclad divorce settlement, had left him with nothing. The house he once flaunted had been sold, and his reputation was irreparably damaged. Their absence was a quiet reminder of their downfall, a testament to the choices they'd made and the lives they'd destroyed. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the yard in a warm, golden glow, Sophia and I found ourselves standing off to the side, watching the festivities. I raised my glass, a small smile tugging at my lips. To new beginnings, I said. She raised her glass to meet mine. To new beginnings. We clinked our glasses and took a sip, the quiet satisfaction of the moment settling over us. This wasn't the life I had envisioned all those months ago, when Clara's betrayal had torn everything apart. It wasn't the life Sophia had planned, either, but it was ours, and it was better than anything we could have imagined.